Good morning, everybody. Buenos días a todos. Les damos la más cordial de las bienvenidas a esta segunda sesión de nuestro seminario binacional. I hope you're very well today, so we are waiting for all our audience to join the session. So let me introduce myself. My name is Adriana Hernández Martínez. I am the coordinator of the program Licenciatura en Enseñanza de Inglés at Acatlán. So I'm so glad to see so many colleagues and students in the session in this morning in Mexico City and afternoon in the UK. So if we are set, we may start our session today. So everybody, thank you very much for your attendance today. Welcome to this second session of the first Binacional seminar between LEI and Manchester Metropolitan University. I have the pleasure to introduce this morning in Mexico and afternoon in the UK to our teacher at LEI, Licenciada Mariana Velázquez Nava. She's our first speaker today. So let me tell you some information about Mariana Velázquez Nava. Profesora de la Licenciatura en Enseñanza de Inglés y también del Diplomado de Traducción de Textos en Inglés y Español en la Facultad de Estudios Superiores Acatlán en la UNAM. Es responsable de la sección de traducciones en el Centro de Enseñanza de Idiomas en la FES Acatlán. También es perito intérprete y traductor autorizado para auxiliar en la administración de justicia y ante las representaciones de Estados Unidos, Canadá, Reino Unido y Australia. Without any further ado, I'd like to welcome warmly Mariana Velázquez Nava. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you everyone, and thank you for that wonderful presentation. Hello to Professor Suchit, Professor Carl. It's my pleasure of being here today, and I want to thank everyone that is here for your attention, your time, and hopefully you will enjoy today's presentation. Let me start by sharing my screen with you. Okay, well today let me tell you a little bit about me and how I came to be at UNAM. I graduated from UNAM, Acatlán, very proudly as an attorney at law. This happened many years ago, believe it or not, and I decided to continue my studies as an interpreter translator. So for the past 15 years, legal translation has been my passion, my life. And as an expert witness translator, now, you're probably wondering, what is an expert witness? An expert witness translator is just a regular translator, but he or she has been acknowledged and recognized by the judicial power of that country. Thus, he or she has the capacity to translate and certify legal documents, being responsible for the translation of such documents. Now, as a translator and interpreter, of course, I've had the opportunity to work on an endless amount of documents, broad range of topics, and of course, I've met a plethora of people, anything and everything from politicians, CEOs, singers, my friends, people at the university who are now my colleagues, and of course, my beloved students. Now, with this in mind, it was endless the amount of subjects and topics that I had to ponder upon for today's presentation. And even though there's quite a bit, I decided to choose a topic that I believe quite a few people are familiar with. Yet, this is quite vital in the translation world. Translations that travel from one country to another and around the globe. So please, everyone, stay awake and alert because this will be a brief but very valuable presentation. Now, I would like to start with the phrase that goes, knowledge is the one thing that no one can take away from you. And I believe so. I believe that once we are empowered with the knowledge, that is something that no one can ever erase from our head. So today, I hope to enlighten your knowledge with an apostille. This is an apostille. Apostille comes from the French word meaning certification. It was established in the 1961 Hague Convention as a simple way to legalize the content of a document, thus avoiding diplomatic and consular procedures and time. As you can see, this is the layout for an apostille. It has the title, it has the reference of the convention of 1961, and each side must be 9 centimeters long. It has a 10-number layout. This layout, as we see it right now, must always be respected. Now, for number 1, we have the country. This is in reference to the country where the apostille comes from, place of origin, or its birthplace. It is followed by the phrase, this public document. Now, let me pause here a moment and let me explain the difference between a public and a private document. Private document is the document that is issued or entered by between private parties, regular citizens like you and me. But a public document is one that is issued or entered by in between officials with the authority to officially attest to the facts, the signature, or the information in that document. Now, let's move on to number 2. This is signed. It refers to the authority who issued such apostille. It is based on the jurisdiction. Jurisdiction is the legal authority for the location of that area. Number 3, this refers to the legal capacity of the issuing authority. It normally corresponds to the Secretary of State, the governor, county clerk, or even the rector of a university. Number 4, this is the official seal or stamp, but this is more of a visual description. We must write out what type of seal goes in this part. It is then followed by the word certified. Now, for number 5, we have the place of origin or location. This is actually the state where the apostille was certified. It could be California or Texas or quite a few others. Number 6 is the date in which the apostille was issued. It must include a day, a month, and a year. Number 7 is the officer or authority who certified the apostille, and this could be different from the previous one. For number 8, we have the number. This is a unique registration or record number that will be assigned to that apostille, sort of like an ID. Number 9 is the actual seal or stamp that we mentioned in number 4, but here we can actually see it. And for number 10, we have the signature. That is the signature of the authority who certified. Now, you have the information within an apostille. This is the layout, and this is the information you should always have. Let me show you an actual sample of an apostille. This is a current sample. Of course, have modified the information to protect personal data, but this is an actual apostille as we see it. It is in just one language. It's in English. So we would probably translate it into Spanish. It seems quite simple, right? We have all the information in detail, and it's just one language. Pretty okay. As translators, we know that we have to translate from source language into a target language. But what about the case of a trilingual apostille? This is a trilingual apostille. We have more than source and target language. In this case, and according to AUSIT's best practice for the translation of legal documents, which is used in Australia and New Zealand, let's say they are the most strict in this manner. They recommend or they tell us that we must still translate from the source into the target language. For the case of a third or fourth language, we must use square brackets. Square brackets are placed in order to write an explanation. In this case, we would write foreign language or French language. It also applies in the case of the seal or signatures. Yes, I know this is the original document and we can clearly see it. But in the case of a translated document, we must not copy and paste. We must also use brackets in order to explain that this is a signature or illegible signature. In the case of the stamp, we must also explain what type of stamp or seal. There's ink seals, embossed seals, and stamps. Now, you're probably wondering, okay, so I know what an apostille is, but will I ever use it? Will it affect me? Of course. Yes, I understand that COVID has stopped us from traveling, from doing a lot of what we would normally do. But it will not be eternal, no. Thus, maybe in the future, you would like to travel to the UK or from the UK to Mexico, either to study, to get married, maybe just to go to Vegas. And that's great. But in that case, your marriage certificate or your school transcripts would have to have an apostille attached. Some of the documents that are normally apostille include birth and marriage certificates, diplomas, school transcripts, and IDs. Now, with COVID, and as we move on with modern times, e-apostille or electronic apostilles are also okay. Of course, you would have to check with the country where you were to exhibit to see if they are accepted. Now, this is the information for an apostille. We have information for the UK and we have information for Mexico. Normally, you would have to request an apostille in person, but now you can do it through the website or an email. Of course, the cost, the type of document, and the time it takes will vary, even within one country. As a general information or fact, apostilles in the UK are 30 euros and in Mexico, 843 pesos. Now, we think, well, is that why apostilles are so important? Yes. Apostilles are made so we can avoid all that waste of time, paperwork, and we can accept documents in between different countries. You might think, well, English and Spanish look pretty much the same, but what about Japanese, Russian, or Arabic? We may not even know what type of document it is, much less understand it, but with an apostille, they will be accepted anywhere. So before I close off, and I told you this would be brief, but to the point, I want to talk a little about a person. Not just the story, but a quote that he has made quite famous. This is a guy called Paul Villafuerte. His story is that of a young man who had to endure quite tough times. And you know, it's sort of like now with COVID. I'm sure everyone is facing their own hardships and tough times. Yes, the past few months have been more than hard, tough, a struggle for everyone in their own way or manner. But Paul, even though with all the problems, he even lost a limb and his daughter became ashamed of him, it did not stop him from moving on, from succeeding. This young man decided to use exercise as a way of power. He set up a gym, he moved on, continued to grow, and now helps other young men and women. As a matter of fact, he's quite famous. He's even on TV series and YouTube. His phrase, sin miedo al éxito. In other words, do not be afraid to succeed. So for everyone out there, let me tell you, COVID will not be eternal. It's coming to an end with vaccines. And of course, we will go back to our lives in a way or another. And once we do, I'm sure that a lot of us will succeed in many different ways or manners. So please, don't be afraid of succeeding once this is all over and we move on. I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank everyone that was here, the invitation, and especially I want to thank my husband for all of his technical assistance. I'm not good with that, but thank you. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you very much, Mariana. Thanks a lot for this lightning presentation. If you agree, we may look at some of the questions that our audience they are sharing in the chat. So is it okay if I read them to you?
Yes, please.
Okay. This question is in, or well, this comment is in Spanish. Me ha pasado que algunos clientes me solicitan traducción y apostilla de documentos. ¿Las apostillas pueden solicitar las personas ajenas?
Sí, lo importante es que acudan ante la autoridad responsable. Aquí en México es en la zona rosa y deben de llevar los documentos. Se pagan los costos dependiendo del tipo de documento y cuánto se van a apostillar y puede presentarla otra persona. Obviamente, un traductor no tiene la capacidad de apostillar. Esto lo hace el gobierno o una persona con fe pública.
De acuerdo, muchas gracias. No sé si nuestra audiencia tiene alguna otra pregunta que quisiera compartir en este momento o podríamos quizás también esperar al final de la sesión para mencionar si hay alguna otra. Creo que por el momento esa sería la participación de nuestra audiencia. Mariana, quizás en unos minutos podemos regresar contigo. Oh, tenemos una más de la maestra Emma Navarrete. Nos pregunta si un notario puede apostillar.
No, son dos cosas distintas. Un notario tiene la capacidad de certificar, pero no de apostillar. Es decir, un notario le da esa validez o legalidad dentro de un país, pero el apostille es para presentarse fuera del país. Bien, el documento se puede llevar ante un notario, se protocoliza y después ese documento ya protocolizado debe de ser apostillado. De hecho, eso es lo que algunos trámites requieren en cuestiones de asambleas, de actas constitutivas o de importaciones o exportaciones.
Muchas gracias, Mariana. Como la licenciada Velázquez mencionó, ella tiene formación también en leyes, por ello es una fuente muy importante para conocer estos detalles. Me parece que esa es la pregunta al momento. Si nos permites, Mariana, quizás podemos regresar contigo entonces. Bueno, nos comentan en el chat ahora, son dos pasos diferentes. ¿Es cierto esto entonces?
Sí, son dos pasos diferentes, pero depende de qué se va a hacer con ese documento. El notario lo certifica y eso tiene validez en México, o un notario de Londres tendría validez en Londres. Pero si ese documento se va a sacar del país, entonces debe de ser apostillado. Son dos trámites distintos y sí son dos pasos distintos, pero depende de la finalidad que se le va a dar al documento.
Muy bien. Nos comentan entonces que esta aclaración que nos hace la ponente es muy importante, ya que la certificación generalmente se pide antes del apostillado. Y nuestra participante Mariana Esparza nos pregunta, ¿solo se utiliza en algunos países? ¿Solo en los incluidos en la Convención de la Haya?
Sí. La apostilla es únicamente para los países que forman parte de la Convención de la Haya. Hasta febrero de este año eran más de 120. Y para el caso de aquellos que no, entonces ya se debe de hacer ese trámite de certificación, ya sea ante el consulado o ante la Secretaría de Relaciones Exteriores.
Excelente. Nuestra participante Jessica Barajas pregunta, ¿la traducción del apostillado oficial también se tiene que validar legalmente?
No, no entendí la pregunta, no sé a qué se refiere por validar legalmente. Una apostille por sí solo tiene esa validez porque, como les explicaba, es un documento público. La persona o autoridad que lo emite está investido con la fe pública, entonces ya es válido por sí mismo. Si se debe de traducir por un perito traductor, sí. En el caso de un idioma, como les enseñé el ejemplo de inglés a español o a otro idioma, es nada más de idioma fuente a idioma meta, y en el caso de que sea trilingüe, pues nada más volvemos a que es en el idioma fuente al idioma meta.
Muchas gracias. Esta sería nuestra última pregunta al momento. Mencionaba que quizás al final la licenciada Velázquez nos permita regresar con ella si tenemos alguna otra participación. Muchas gracias a ella por su tiempo el día de hoy y creo que podríamos dar la bienvenida a nuestro siguiente ponente. Nos piden, Mariana, el correo electrónico, creo que estaba en tu presentación, pero si nos puedes ayudar en el chat escribiéndolo nuevamente. Gracias.
Claro que sí, un gusto. Y I now give the word to Dr. Carl. My pleasure sharing this seminar with him.
Thank you very much, Mariana. So I am honored to present our next speaker. We are welcoming Dr. Carl McLaughlin. He's a professional interpreter and translator with extensive experience in translating press releases and other content for English language media in Spain. He's a former head of several leading postgraduate programs in translation and interpreting and currently teaches both subjects at undergraduate level at Manchester Metropolitan University. In addition to these specialisms, his main field of academic research is 17th century Spanish literature, particularly female authors. So I am very honored again. I want to say that I'm very honored to welcome this morning, this afternoon to Dr. Carl. So the floor is yours, please.
Well, thank you very much, and good evening, everybody. Good evening, because it's 5:30 over here in England, and I understand it's a lot earlier in Mexico, and probably better weather as well, but we make do with what we can. It's my privilege to be part of this two-nation seminar, and I thought I would try and give you a behind-the-scenes look at probably a lesser-known aspect of the work of a linguist or a translator. It ties in a little bit with what we've just heard from our previous speaker, Mariana Velázquez, in the sense that it's about information that crosses borders and crosses languages, as you will see. And I'm going to give you quite a detailed presentation. I hope it proves practical, that will be based on my own professional experience in this field. It's something that I use quite a lot in class. I use media translation in my teaching. So if there are any teachers present, perhaps they will find this useful. So I'm going to talk to you essentially about the job of a person who translates information that appears in a newspaper, which is in a different language to the original language of the newspaper, the original newspaper. So anyway, I'll come to, and please stop me as I'm going along if you have any questions. I'm going to share my screen with you. And let's see, can we make this as user-friendly as possible? So could, Angelica, could you confirm, please, that you can see this screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay. So I'm going to be talking to you about what I would call a hybrid discipline, media translation. I've put some front pages of newspapers, the typical newspaper that I'm talking about, up here on the screen for you. So my thanks to UNAM for the invitation. Thank you to the organizers, and I hope this proves beneficial. If nothing else, you will get some practice in listening to the English voice of somebody who doesn't have an American accent. So let's proceed. Essentially, I'm going to talk to you today about media translation as a, if you like, creative hybrid. It involves translation, but it also involves adaptation. And some people see this as part of the overall transcreation context, which you may or may not be familiar with in your studies already if you do translation. And what I'll try and do is give some very specific examples and then look at a case study from Spain to illustrate what's different about the, in inverted commas, translation work that's required for media translation. I'll look a little bit at the sources, so what content appears in these newspapers and publications. I'll look a little bit also at how the translator adapter goes about treating the text. And then towards the end, I'll look at some of the problems that arise. Now, to begin with, what is media translation? I'm sure you can think of many different possibilities here. It could be somebody who translates documents that are used by the media in some sense or other. I'll give you one example here. One possibility, and this is a field that I have worked in for many years, is the direct translation of news or information issued by authorities in a given country. Now, this could be, and this ties in with what the previous speaker said about COVID, it could be press releases, comunicados de prensa, on urgent topics such as COVID, coronavirus outbreaks. These press releases are produced by the national authorities or the regional authorities, and they're sent to international media because the country or the region in question want to send out some reassurance on the extent of a problem. I'm thinking here in particular of coronavirus. Mexico did send a lot of press releases when coronavirus outbreaks were experienced in places like Acapulco to reassure the tourist industry that the correct measures were being taken. And often here, the quality of the translation is crucial because a poor translation will damage the image of that location and the authorities. The authorities engage in what we call a damage limitation exercise. They want to reassure the public that the situation is under control, while at the same time giving accurate data as to that situation. Here is one such example. This is a communiqué or a press release issued almost exactly 1 year ago. So when the coronavirus outbreak was really beginning in a serious way in parts of Europe. And this was issued by the authorities in a very popular tourist area called the Canary Islands. More on them later. So this is direct translation. You translate all the content and make sure that the style is adapted to the target language. But that's not what I'm going to be talking to you about today. Let me say a few words on translation to begin with. Now, when we think of translation, we have the conventional approach, if you like. And that conventional approach essentially involves producing an accurate and a faithful target text for an equivalent target audience. The translator's job is to convey the full information and, where possible, respect the lexical and stylistic features of the source text. Now, this can be quite easy when the purpose, if you like, the function of the two texts, the source and the target text, are similar. I'm thinking here of, let's say, legislation or a scientific paper written by a Mexican scientist to be published in an international journal in English, or a literary work. However, as we'll see, it's not always the case. And this is why I've put commas around translation in my title, Media Translation, because as we'll see, it's not necessarily just translation. I'd like to say a few words on the current age or ages that we are in today. And the cartoon at the top here, in the top left, this just in, we have breaking news retracting the breaking news that corrected the previous breaking news. I think this sums up one of our ages today, which is an age, the digital age, in which news is of paramount importance. We're obsessed with watching, reading, knowing what's going on every minute of the day. This, of course, is facilitated by new technologies. And I don't need to explain to you what those technologies might be. But suffice to say that at the tip of a fingertip, we can find out what's happening anywhere in the world. There is another age also, and that is the age of mobility. Think of the number of professionals who work in different countries. They have a mobile office, digital nomads, as they're called. Those numbers are increasing dramatically. You work in a different country because you have the technology. That free movement also applies to normal people, inverted commas, particularly in Europe. And I thought I'd give you some figures to show the extent of this situation. France, for example, receives 12 million British tourists every year. There are 400,000 resident British and American citizens in France. Spain, fewer British tourists, but a much bigger expat or migrant population, resident in the areas which you may or may not be familiar with, the Costa del Sol, the Balearic Islands, and the Canary Islands. Now, why am I mentioning this? There is a reason. And it's because the fact that people have access to news, they want to see news, generates an industry which is the translation of news. And there are many multilingual news agencies. I've put up some names here for you: Agence Europe, Agencia EFE, and all these agencies require their original news in their mother tongue language to be translated. So that's one reflection of our news age. A second one in the case of Spain, excuse me, is the massive growth in news sources in English. There are several British newspapers that actually print in Spain. Such is the demand. But interestingly also, there are several Spanish daily newspapers that print in English also. And there is a mushrooming of English newspapers. We'll look at some of those in just a moment. The important part here is they need native English-speaking media staff and translators. Many of these are located in major cities, Madrid, Barcelona, etc., and above all, in tourist areas. In Spain, you have the following. You have at national level or regional level, El País in English, the Olive Press, the Local. These are just some examples. And in tourist areas, you have interesting publications such as the Costa News, Murcia Today, Sur in English, and the Mallorca Daily Bulletin. This is just a screenshot of El País in English. Some stories that appeared the other day: COVID passport, the new world's opening up for the vaccinated, Supreme Court, a decision taken there. The point I want to draw your attention to here is that the names of the people who have written these articles are the names of the original Spanish journalists. They don't write in English. The people who provide the English versions don't appear in what's called the bylines. That's the names of the authors. However, in El País, so Spain's leading daily newspaper, they do acknowledge who does the English version. At the bottom of each article, they will mention the name of the person. That's El País at national level. In a tourist area, you have this newspaper, the Mallorca Daily Bulletin. And the interesting thing about this newspaper is that it is part of a media group which has several local Spanish papers. Now, this obviously creates synergies. So I wonder, can you think of what sort of advantages might be available here? Well, there are no copyright issues. You can take their information from the Spanish counterpart and translate it or adapt it into English easily. You can use the photographs. Essentially, you are benefiting from what the parent company has, and that's a very good idea. Those are just two examples of English language newspapers in Spain. Now, a question I always wonder is, where do these newspapers, and I'm thinking here of the second category rather than El País, these typical what are called expat papers, where do they get the content from? The primary source of content is the content that already appears in the Spanish media. That's the first and most important source of content. The second one is official press releases. That is, as I said earlier, information given by government departments, town halls, the police, the courts, the emergency services, any official body. They release lots of official information. And that information is a very important source for English language newspapers. There is a third area of content, which is what's called own production. Now, that could be interviews, contributions by third parties, which usually take the form of what are called advertorials. So they're stories, articles, but really are subliminal publicity for the company or person in question. Now, I'm only going to look at 1 and 2 here because they have something in common, and that is that they need to be translated or adapted or glossed for an English readership, whereas number 3 doesn't. Here's a typical example of a press release. We can see here at the top, it says Sala de Prensa. It's from the Policía Nacional, Madrid, and it concerns a major drug crime breakthrough, which was made thanks to international cooperation, including the British authorities. So this sort of story would be of great interest. And I'm sure you probably saw this in the news very, very recently. Because, although it's difficult to get this information from this very long Spanish headline, typical media release headline in Spanish, it's difficult to work out what the story is. But if you look at the English version, i.e. what was produced in an English publication, you will see. The important part here was that the drug traffickers were using a submergible, like a mini submarine, and it's the first time this has ever been discovered. So this is a very different approach. Look at the headline compared to the previous one, the Spanish one. I'll just take you back. That's the original press release. This is what the English language publication does with it. Another typical press release. So we've got La Policía Nacional again. It's people and drug trafficking, obviously of interest to English-speaking residents in the islands in question. And the fact that they have this official photograph is of interest too, because your newspaper, if you're a worker at the newspaper, can use that because it's an official photograph. Another one. Here, it's details of credit card fraud on the island of Tenerife. Now, this is of clear interest to English readers, because they would want to know what the modus operandi of the fraudsters was. So that would be of interest to put in your newspaper. Excuse me. Now, when you come to, in inverted commas, translate these official press releases, there are a number of considerations to bear in mind. The first one is a potential conflict. And I wonder, can anybody think about what that conflict might be? Would you like to put in some suggestions in the chat? What might the conflict be in terms of how you would go about translating or adapting this for an English language newspaper? So we have somebody has raised their hand. Could the organizers please control who can speak and who can't, please? Unfortunately, I can't see the chat on this. Let's just see what the comment is. No, I can't see any comments. So I'll just proceed anyway and say what I think in this case. The potential conflict here is the nature of the text, the function, the purpose of the text. And let me try and explain the conflict in a few words. In many cases, a press release that's issued by an official body, yes, it does have some news, but often it's publicity for those authorities. Aren't we brilliant? Police make arrests. Council does something, the local authorities, the mayor, the councillor. And it's often publicity for them as opposed to actual news that is of value to the readership. And this is one of the problems that we have when we're dealing with these press releases. When you come to translating, in inverted commas, these press releases, you must bear in mind that the news value is what comes first. You have to operate on the basis of what we call the 4 W's of journalism. What happened? Where did it happen? Who did it? Who was involved? Who was the victim? And perhaps there will be why also. So it's not simply a case of direct, literal, linear translation. The press release has to be adapted in some way. And in many cases, you will have to domesticate, this is translation theory terminology, domesticate for the readership by perhaps explaining local terms or institutions. And of course, a last consideration is that the press release may be very long, but you only have a short space on your newspaper page because you've got lots of advertisements. Those are considerations that you have to take into account. Another consideration is that often the local authority or the government in question will try and help you in your job. They will give you the press release translated into English or written directly in English already. In the case of local authorities, bear in mind that they always try and seek maximum visibility for their successes, their services, and particularly for their people, their officials. So they often translate their texts themselves and give them to the English media. The problem is that they're not always native or professional translators. And because of that, the text that they have generously provided you is not always publishable. The style could be poor. The English could be poor. In fact, in many cases, it can be just a mere translation of the original press release, but it doesn't match the expectations of English newspaper style. This is where the problem arises, because you often have to take a decision as to whether you can work on that version to improve it, Or do you go and find the original Spanish press release and work from that? It's often quicker to do the latter, I can tell you. Let's look at some examples. I'm sorry there's so much text on the screen here, but I wanted you to see exactly how much content goes into these press releases. If you can just skim read it with me for a moment, you'll see the amount of detail, but also you'll see something else, what is being made visible throughout. This is a press release, as you can see, in Spanish, issued by a popular tourist area with many English-speaking residents, so they will read the local English papers. And the subject is more parking spaces, particularly during the run-up to Christmas. Look at the amount of information there. It's very dense, it's very heavy. So the authorities in Adeje decided they would help by providing an English version, thinking that the newspaper could publish it. I'm going to show you the English version, and you can tell me whether you think it would work. I hope that's visible. You can see that essentially it's just a literal version of the Spanish. There's no real attempt to turn it into news. And I've drawn arrows here so that you can see the number of times that there is mention of the council itself, the ayuntamiento, the town, the councillor, the person, the official, appears a lot. He's mentioned by name, he's got lots of quotes. In other words, the press release doesn't really focus on the news interest, but in rendering the person and the council very visible. Now that doesn't work in an English language paper. So the translator would have to do something with that to make it better. I'm going to show you some examples of different techniques that are used when you take Spanish source news materials and you think about how they would work better in English. This is a famous headline, a famous news story, which appeared in El País in English last month, in fact, exactly a month ago. It was very, very popular as a story. And look at, for example, the way it's presented. And then I'm going to show you the way it's presented in English. If you look at the English, for example, the headline is very different. It's much punchier, much more direct and concise. The information is organized differently as well. So by juxtaposing those two versions, Spanish and English, you can see just how much work on the adaptation side is done in addition to actual translation. I won't bore you with too many further examples, but this is one that I've done a lot of work on. This is a story that also appeared in El País some years ago, and it's probably the best example of the different styles. If you look here, you can see in the first paragraph, it's a general comment on the church's view of homosexuality. That's the opening paragraph of this story. The story is of great public interest, a very topical subject, but the Spanish journalist's approach is very different to the English translator stroke news writer approach. I'm going to show you their version now. So please look at the first paragraph and compare that to this. In the English version, the approach is very different. It is purely news value. It tells us what happened, where it happened, and who was involved. Very different to the Spanish original. I did a study of these contrasting approaches, and I noticed that the Spanish text was much longer, and yet the English coverage was much more factual and detailed. even though it had fewer words. And I think this is a very good example of the work that a translator adapter does when working for an English language media. To end, I'm going to take you to the Canary Islands. I've put them on a map here so you can see where they are. You guys are over here. We're up here, and the Canaries are down here. A set of Spanish islands with millions of tourists every year, many residents from Britain who own second homes, and they use the local papers in English as an important source of information. One of these publications actually is no longer with us, unfortunately. It used to have a weekly edition. It was distributed on all the islands, and it had not just the printed version, but a daily digital edition. And most of its news was translated, in inverted commas, news. But let's look just for a few minutes to end at some typical, examples. That's just a front page of that newspaper from a few years ago. The translator here did two different jobs. For the digital version, the translator had to look at local media the previous night, very late or very early in the morning, improve on the press releases from other bodies, and essentially, with all that information, produce 3 to 4 good articles to be uploaded by 9 a.m. on the digital version. For the printed version, they did more or less the same, but under less time pressure, because the printed version was weekly or fortnightly, and they would produce about 20 texts per edition. Some of these were long, some of these were shorter. What sort of texts, you may be asking? Well, let's have a look at a typical example of work. In this case, the information is from a Ministry of Employment press release, which appeared in one of the local Spanish papers. It was all about a new initiative to detect undeclared employment. Now, of course, that's very interesting to English-speaking employers and workers for various reasons. A new mechanism. This is what appeared in the Spanish newspapers. You'll see in a moment. The translator, adapter, had to take the original story, extract the relevant information, and produce a short and direct piece, because there was only a small section of the newspaper to put it in. The translator had to resolve a number of translation challenges. For example, the word buzón translates literally as letterbox, but in this case, it doesn't work. So what is the equivalent phenomenon in English? False friends, la seguridad social. In English, it's not social security in this case, it's national insurance contributions. So in short, while thinking about space and other considerations, the translator had to do normal translation work and resolve these challenges. So what I'll do is I'm going to show you a bit of the actual text, let you see it, and then I'll show you what the translator produced. This is part of the press release. And if you can spend a couple of seconds just looking at it to extract the information. I have highlighted in red some of the issues that would cause a particular issue for a translation. So things that you would have to make sure came across in correct English, so adapted to English expectations. Anyway, that's the story, a very dry, typical statistical press release, but trying to display the success of a Department of Employment initiative. And this is what appeared in the English newspaper. You can see it's rather more direct. It tells the story, very factual. It gets all the information in, but in a style that is very different to the original press release. I'll let you look at it just for a couple of minutes. If you'll allow me, I will take you back to the original press release. And then back again to the story to see the difference. So this adapter translator has come up with anonymous tip-offs as the whistleblower mechanism. So that's their way of explaining what the buzón is. So, ladies and gents, there you have it. Media translation in the sense of adapting content for English language media. There is a great demand for this sort of news in English in many parts of Spain, and I'm sure in other countries also. I'm mentioning it today because it's a possible field of work for people with good language skills who also have good writing journalistic skills. And as I've tried to stress, it's not so much translation as, if you like, creative adaptation. To do it, we need speed, we need to have a good eye and ear for news, we need to be able to write very directly, and of course, summarize. Sometimes you get help, but often that help, it's not really help. And you have to go back to the drawing board, as they say. So that's what I had to share with you today. I hope you found it interesting as a different angle on translation. And of course, I'm very willing to take any questions that come my way. I will stop sharing my screen. And back to our hosts.
Thank you very much, Doctor. I would like to read some of the comments that we have from our audience. The first one is Gilberto Mendoza. He asks, what would the considerations be with language variations, for instance, Spanish?
Well, it's written language, and often the style of writing in written publications such as media, the variation is not as broad as it might be in an oral context. But clearly, if you have been brought up in a diet of, in my case, peninsular Spanish from Spain, I would probably have more difficulty translating news content from a Mexican newspaper for use in Acapulco or anywhere in Guerrero. I would need to make sure that I wasn't misreading something because of my ignorance of the language variation at local level.
Thank you very much. I think it has to do also with the term you explained, right? To domesticate the language, to understand the words in a more deep way, right?
Yes, because your readers don't want to do any work. They don't want to get the feeling that they're reading a translation. They buy the newspaper to be told things directly in language that they understand. So it does put a lot of pressure on the translator stroke adapter to make sure that comes across clearly without straying too far from the original meaning. So the domestication is important, but you can't stray too far.
Thank you very much. Diana Sofia Gonzalez, I think this is related to the slide where you were asking the audience about the possible conflict of interest. She says that the information could be damaging for the government.
It could be, and I take the point, perhaps I didn't phrase the conflict the way I might have. I was talking really about the conflict between what the intention is of the sender of the press release compared to the need of the newspaper. So it's the disguised publicity versus actual news conflict. So I can see, thank you, Dan. I'm sorry, I probably didn't make that clear, but yes, information can be damaging, but they are the ones that issued the information. That's not your problem.
Right. Mariana Esparza, she writes in Spanish. Muy interesante el tema. En México muchos de los diarios y publicaciones cuentan ya con un grupo de traductores que trabajan de la mano de los periodistas y que están familiarizados con los términos que deben emplearse. Es muy raro que contraten externos para este tipo de trabajo.
A very good point. Thank you for that. It is true. And even in Spain also, many of the leading publications like El País or The Local in Spanish, instead of sending work to translators, so from an agency, they would often work with maybe journalists who have set up in Spain, who have got very good language skills. So that more or less follows the line that we've just seen in that comment from Mariana. It's not just a matter of sending text to an agency to have them translated. They need to know that the translator, and I keep saying in inverted commas, knows how to turn the content into newsworthy content.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Mariana says, additionally, that en la página de Fondu se incluyen muchos ejemplos y textos actualizados para ayudarnos en la traducción adecuada de este tipo de publicaciones. Asumo que se trata de una página web.
And thank you for that information. I'm taking note of it because I will certainly look at it to see can I use it for my classes.
Okay. All right. Professor Emma Navarrete thanks you for the presentation, and she says that it is very interesting. If our audience would like to ask any other questions to our speaker, please do it in the chat box. And I am also looking at the Facebook live chat in case you want to ask any other question or to state any other comment.
If I may say something before you hand over to comment, sure. I was quite disappointed that Mexico's leading news agency closed. Was it about a year ago? And I thought that that would be the ideal agency to have teams of translators putting news into English. But then suddenly, for political reasons, I assume, it disappeared off the map. So if anything similar exists, I would be interested to know.
Yeah, unfortunately, as you said, it has to do more with politics and information, or what the Mexicans would like to have for our information. But as far as I know, we have here some communicators. As far as I know, unfortunately, there is no plan to open it again or to have a new agency. Diana participates again, and she says that El Universal, which is a very popular newspaper in Mexico, it used to have an English version, yet it closed back in October. Okay, so that's unfortunate.
While over here we're opening more and more, and Mexico's closing them. In any case, you can go back into this sort of these websites and take the original texts and take the English version text. It's a very interesting study in how the same information is conveyed in a different way to meet target audience expectations. And I would encourage all of you who teach translation or use it in your classes to look at this as a very motivating and real-life exercise for students, rather than just translating the standard texts.
Sure. And Dr. Ana Maria Martinez, who is a teacher in LEI, Acatlán, she asked, it would be important to compare styles. Could you say so, Dr. Carl?
Certainly. I think it's a very fruitful area of research to compare the styles of the English language, a successful English language version. And I do draw a distinction between a good English language version and just a literal translation of an English language version. And I should point out that in many cases in Spain, some of the smaller expat newspapers are not very good. They simply, it's almost as if they have put the story through a machine translation software program, and they don't really edit them properly. So I'm not saying that all of them are good, but certainly stylistic comparisons are a very fruitful area of research, and maybe perhaps even a good area for people to do their dissertations, the trabajo de fin de carrera, extended essays, things like that, comparing the styles of the two.
Right. It's very interesting, the exercise that you are suggesting for us, because there is a major in Acatlán, which is communication, and they take English classes. So I'd say for those teachers of English in that major, they could exercise with their students not only reading or writing or grammar, but also the skills that you are suggesting right now for them, like to compare what kind of language, what is the style that they are using. So it would be, I think, a very good way to not only practice English, like grammar, but also to take them to their field, which is communication and journalism. I think there's another comment. One of the challenges of journalistic translation is that sometimes the journalist may have an idea that could be good for the audience in the original language, yet it can be problematic when translated.
I'm not sure what problematic means in this sense. Is it problematic in the sense that it's difficult to translate, or it might cause problems if translated? So I'm thinking of authoritarian regimes, and they avoid certain words. Many years ago in Chinese, you never used the word democracy, for example. So of course, an English language version couldn't use the word democracy. But I think one of the challenges that arises is that when to take Diana Sofia's comment, when the journalist makes reference to something that is implicit or is known by the original audience, because they probably know the scenario and the story, that has to be made more explicit by the translator adapter. And that can be quite difficult, how far to go in that explicitation.
Okay, I'm checking for more comments. Ana Maria Martinez asked how free, oh, this is very interesting, doctor, because you mentioned enjoy freedom, if you've got it. So Dr. Martinez says, how free are translators to adapt? This might be a cultural issue.
Oh, I'm sorry I put up that thing about freedom. I'm just checking for time here. Are you all okay for time? I'm worried that I'm keeping people from other things, but these questions are brilliant and it gives me a great opportunity to explore them. The freedom aspect. I like this type of work because it gives me creativity and freedom, but that's because when I've done it, it's because of the rapport, the relationship I have with the people who hire me. They trust me because of my writing instincts. I don't think it would be always the case with the new translator stroke adapter. they would probably be kept on a much tighter rein, a tighter lead, if you like. Whereas the more experienced you are, the more they trust you that you can spot what's needed. So that's the freedom I mean. I quite like that. It probably doesn't apply to everybody, but perhaps it's because of the number of years that I have been doing it that people trust me a bit more. So I have two hats, translator and journalist.
Okay, so I think we could take a last question. Angelica, is it okay? All right. So we have Hilary Lopez. She writes, regarding the publicity factor that you mentioned, if the journal where you are publishing the translation asks you to lose this particular purpose, what should you do if the original text is not that factual and focuses more on the publicity factor?
Is this being recorded?
I think it is.
Okay, let me be diplomatic in my answer then. Thank you, Hilary. That is a superb question. And I want to explain to you one of the dilemmas that arise. Maybe Hilary can answer the question for me in the chat box. Where do newspapers get a lot of their revenue from? Or maybe I will answer myself. They get it from, oh, sorry, something's come in. I'm just looking at the message. Advertising, of course, yes. Of course, advertising. In Spain and in many Latino cultures, that advertising is not necessarily from the private sector. It is from the public sector. So a local authority will take out a half page or a full page advertisement in your newspaper for its whatever carnival program or its Christmas festivities. They're paying you, but they also expect in exchange that you publish what they send you. And this is where the problem arises, because often English language media have less of that approach. And an English reader would be put off with so many references to the name of a person, the name of a body, what they've done. They'd be looking for the news. So it is a very difficult call to make, because if the local authority is financing your newspaper, partly through advertising, big page advertisers, they're going to be very annoyed if you censure the name of their person, the quotes that they give, etc. It is a very difficult line not to cross. I'm sorry that I didn't mention this earlier. I was hoping to avoid it, but Hilary, you forced me to speak about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Carl. Well, I think that would be all the questions that we've got so far. In that case, I would like to thank again both our speakers for accepting this invitation, for bringing this knowledge, this experience to our community. We really are looking forward for another opportunity to share with you any other session or any other event. So Dr. Carl, Licenciada Mariana, we really appreciate your time, and I would like to ask our audience to give a round of applause. In this case, it'd be virtual, but we really want to say thanks. Thank you very much. And thanks our colleagues, teachers, students for joining us today, this morning, this afternoon. And we're looking forward to seeing you maybe in another time. Thanks a lot on behalf of UNAM, Acatlán, and also Manchester Metropolitan University. Thank you very much.